Let's see.
We thought we'd wait a little bit and see if we get some more people to come.
We're going to wait about 5 minutes.
Yeah. Close enough. I usually say Rebus, but Rabbit is okay.
Okay. And he's the Kansas Poet Laureate. And we had his predecessor, Poet Laureate, here last spring. Really enjoyed the presentation. That Kevin's a jazz musician, a drummer and percussionist, and I was hoping he would make that part of his presentation. So I'm going to enjoy this a lot. I'm going to read some of this stuff so that you have a background. You know, like if you were writing a response paper or something, you might be able to put this in it. Today we're pleased to welcome the Poet Laureate of Kansas, Kevin Rebus, for his presentation, Finding the Extraordinary in the Ordinary. It's brought to us by the Kansas Humanities Council, whom we thank very much for doing this kind of thing for us, because out here in the wilderness, sometimes it's a little hard to get quality cultural events. An organization, a nonprofit organization that connects communities with history, traditions, and ideas to strengthen civic life. So we may all enjoy the program. Please take a moment to turn off any cell phones, please, as you do at a concert. Kevin's a poet, jazz musician, and professor at Emporia who teaches poetry and playwriting. He also chairs the Department of English, Modern Languages, and Journalism. His collection of poems, Lisa's Flying Electric Piano, was a Kansas Notable Book in 2010 and a winner of the Nelson Poetry Book Award. He is the winner of the Langston Hughes Award for Poetry, Victor Kontowski Poetry Award, and Jerome Johanning Playwriting Award, among others. His most recent poetry collection, Songs for My Father, Poems and Stories, was published by Meadowlark in 2016. Please welcome Kevin Rebus.
Nice. Thanks a lot. Thank you to Stacy Freeman and all the folks who brought me here. I really appreciate it, and the Kansas Humanities Council who helps to put this on. I have a game for us, and it's a kind of a game where everybody gets to be a poet. I have started a poem here. It goes, your hand in my hand, like the warmth of an autumn sun, orange and mild. And what I'd like to do is write a line or two or three lines to go along with this, and we'll have a group poem when we're done with the evening. Does that sound good? So everybody a poet tonight. So I'll start it here, and it'll just make its way around, and at the end I'll read it. So we all get to be poets and writers tonight. I did play jazz in Kansas City. I almost paid my rent doing that. I also worked at a jazz archive and also took some pictures during that time. I loved it. I also have volunteered at the American Jazz Museum at 18th and Vine. If you ever have a chance to go there, it's a great experience about Kansas City's place in the great African-American classical music tradition of jazz. So you should check it out if you have a chance. I'm going to do a little bit of drumming with the poems and also, but first I'm going to give a little talk about finding the extraordinary in the ordinary, and that will be my theme, and we'll do some of that, and I'll read some, and then we'll have questions and answers. So if you have questions, keep them in your mind or jot them down, and we'll talk at the end. So the title of the speech is Finding the Extraordinary in the Ordinary, and I'll start with a quote by Naomi Shihab, and she's from St. Louis, so not especially far from here, with a Palestinian father and American mother, and her quote goes like this: poetry helps us to see something we're seeing everywhere, whether inside or outside of us. And this talks about the beauty we can find in all things, the beauty and the magic in all things around us. And there are a lot of poets who write about this, from Nye to Hutchison's William Stafford to the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, who wrote a book called Odes to Ordinary Things. So finding this extraordinary in the ordinary is something that I'm really invested in. As somewhat humble Kansans, we can also find the extraordinary in the ordinary, like maybe we're driving along and there's rain and the turtles come out and go across the road. And we take a moment to stop and move them out of the road so that they're safe. Extraordinary in the ordinary. Also, I want to give you a poem by Nye. Somebody asked her if she was famous, and she said, well, kind of. And this is her answer, this poem. Famous. The river is famous to the fish. The loud voice is famous to silence, which knew it would inherit the earth before anyone said so. The cat sleeping on the fence is famous to the birds watching him from the birdhouse. The tear is famous briefly to the cheek. The idea you carry close to your bosom is famous to your bosom. The boot is famous to the earth, more famous than the dress shoe, which is famous only to floors. The bent photograph is famous to the one who carries it, and not at all famous to the one who is pictured. I want to be famous to shuffling men who smile while crossing streets, sticky children in grocery lines, famous as the one who smiled back. I want to be famous in the way a pulley is famous, or a buttonhole, not because it did anything spectacular, but because it never forgot what it could do. So there's a poem by Naomi Shihab, and since she grew up in St. Louis, she comes back once in a while. You might be able to see her. She's really great. When she was asked about this poem, she says, whatever we pay attention to becomes famous to us. You trust a buttonhole, don't you? So that was her answer. I like to think of the poet's job is to see the extraordinary in the ordinary, to look deeply into things. And here's another quote by Nye. Poetry is not just a surface glance, but a deeper gaze where we look into and not at something. And so I wrote a poem where I was looking at kind of nature, and I was looking out over this rural scene, and I like to go all over the place, rural, suburban, urban places, and I was, and my family's from around Lake Wilson area, Russell, Lucas, Luray, etc. And I was looking at this photo, which a friend of mine had shot, and I wondered what was going on there. And it was in Morris County. It was east off Highway 77 at dusk that he had shot this photo, and I wrote a poem about that. And there's a tradition of writing about art. The ancient Greeks called it ekphrastic poetry, ekphrastic, where you look at something that's an artwork and then you write about it. And there's actually a cool exhibit just around the corner in your gallery. You could go in and do this, right? An ekphrastic, and be in this long ancient tradition. So this is mine. It's called East off of Highway 77 Dusk. Heather light, evening light, lemon rind light, handhold light, quail hovel light, golden time light, first kiss fishing hole light. This is when the starlings fly into the shelter belts, and the hawks find a branch and land and wait for prairie mice to come from holes and cast swift shadows in the tight grass, for wings to flourish and lift, one dive and it's done. We all eat this light up, bask like children's on lawns, and last light at the end of the earth. The sun sinks in the earth crest, and the sun's done. Twilight and its small stars come. So there's one about looking out at nature and also looking at this photograph of that. I want to read one by another a person from Kansas. And this is by Kevin Young, who grew up in Topeka. As a middle schooler, he interned with Thomas Fox Averill, who gave him a curator/editor project as a middle schooler. And now, in his mid-40s, Kevin Young is the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem's curator. He's the head of that. He's an African-American poet in his mid-40s. And he has this really cool poem which draws on black culture, including jazz and also rap, called Expecting. And this is a poem that also gets at something now we might call ordinary as an ultrasound. His wife is getting an ultrasound, and they're listening for the heartbeat of their kid. And I'll read this one out to you. It's called Expecting by Kevin Young. Grave, my wife lies back, hands crossed her chest, while the doctor searches early for your heartbeat. Peach pit, unripe plum, pulls out the world's worst boombox, a Mr. Microphone to broadcast your mother's lifting belly, the whoosh and bellows of mama's body, and beneath it, nothing. Beneath the slow stutter of her heart, nothing. The doctor trying to find you, fragile fern, snowflake, nothing. After, my wife will say in fear, impatient, she went beyond her body, this tiny room, and into the ether. For now, we spelunk for you one last time. Lost canary, miner of coal and chalk, lungs not yet black. I hold my wife's feet to keep her here, and me trying not to dive starboard and see you in the dark water. And there it is, faint and echo, faster and further away than mothers, all beatbox and fuzzy feedback. You are like hearing hip-hop for the first time, power hijacked from a lamppost, all promise. You couldn't sound better, break dancer, my favorite song bumping from a passing car. You've snuck into the club and underage and stayed. Only later much will your mother begin to believe you're drumming in the distance, our Kansas City and Congo Square, this jazz band vamping on inside of her. So there's one by Kevin Young. Topeka, so, person of this state. He lives in New York City now, and Harlem, but he comes back, and he's one of our stars from this state. I'll next read one that's kind of a riff or playing off of a poem by Peruvian poet Cesar Viejo, who lived 1892 to 1938. He has this really famous poem that begins, I will die in Paris on a rainy day. I will die in Paris on a rainy day. And so I imagined, what would my poem that starts kind of like that be like? And when I was at the Curtis Cafe in Stafford, Kansas, I wrote this poem, sitting in a diner. When I die, I will rise in a small-town diner with a seat that faces the Main Street window, and all of the silverware and water glasses and tabletops will shine with afternoon light, and I will know no one who comes in through the front door and sits and eats. We will all watch the street lamps illuminate the uneven brick street and wait for afternoon to pass on into evening, full of shadows, jagged and irregular, the street filling up with darkness, and the way coffee fills up a pale coffee cup. So there it is. Kind of imagining Kevin like being in a diner where you don't know anybody. I'm going to read one that's by a Nebraskan poet, so another Midwesterner, Ted Kuser. At one point, he was the U.S. Poet Laureate, which is the spokesperson for poetry in the United States, whereas right now I'm the spokesman for poetry in our state. And so this is one of the few of the Poet Laureates of the U.S. who was ever a Midwesterner. And he gives this really cool poem, or quote, about what a poem can do. The poem is the device through which the ordinary world is seen in a new way, engaging, compelling, even beautiful. So the poem can kind of like make us think of how beautiful things can be. So this one's called Mother. It's essentially a poem written for his mother who died not so long before he wrote this. Mother, mid-April already, and the wild plums bloom at the roadside, a lacy white against the exuberant, jubilant green of new grass and dusty, fading black and burnt-out ditches. No leaves, not yet, only the delicate star-petal blossoms, sweet with their timeless perfume. You have been gone a month today, and have missed 3 rains and 1 night-long watch for tornadoes. I sat in the cellar from 6 to 8 while fat spring clouds went somersaulting, rumbling east. Then it poured, a storm that walked on legs of lightning, dragging its shaggy belly over the fields. The meadowlarks are back, and the finches are turning from green to gold. Those same 2 geese have come to the pond again this year, honking in over the trees and splashing down. They never nest, but stay a week or 2, then leave. The peonies are up, the red sprouts burning in circles like birthday candles. For this is the month of my birth, as you know, the best month to be born in, thanks to you, everything ready to burst with living. There will be no more new flannel nightshirts sewn on your old black singer, no birthday card addressed in a shaky but businesslike hand. You asked me if I'd be sad when it happened, and I am sad. But the iris I moved from your house now hold in the dusty, dry fists of their roots, green knives and forks as if waiting to dinner, as if spring were a feast. I thank you for that, were it not for the way you taught me to look at the world, to see the life at play in everything, I would have to be lonely forever. So here's a taste of poetry, kind of walking around, about how a boot can be famous to someone who uses those boots and needs them, or a buttonhole or a pulley, how evening light can start a string of fond memories that can bring us into contact with the natural world, hawks and mice and the sun going down, how we might envision a small town diner as a metaphor for heaven, how planting peonies with their flame-like blossoms can remind a man of his mother, and notice how he can cherish the beauty in life, how the important lesson remains and stays forever. Poetry has added spice and value to my own life. It's also given me a meditative space to observe things and to write them down, and any of us can do this. You don't have to be taught how to write poetry, you just have to try it, and you've got poems. And we've got something going around right now to kind of prove that point. Poetry and music is also something. Poetry and music were intrinsically linked in the early stages. The ancient Greeks used a lyre, which is kind of like a harp, and they sung their poetry and played that harp that kind of looks like the things cherubs and angels would play. All cultures had these poet musicians, bards, scops, griots, troubadours. There's a long, long tradition, hundreds, maybe even thousands of years of people combining poetry and music. And so I'm going to do that now. Since I was a jazz musician, I write about it. And this one is called Bird's Horn, about Charlie Parker. He's also a Kansan. He grew up in Kansas City, Kansas. Cut his teeth in Kansas City, Missouri, and then moved on to New York City. He was born in 1920 and lived in 1955. He was kind of the great jazz genius during his time. He played bop, which is the fast version of jazz, so fast that many people, kind of squares, could not play it. And unfortunately, Charlie Parker was addicted to heroin. He was in a horrible car wreck on tour from the Ozarks, and he busted up his spine really bad, and the doctor prescribed heroin. And he said, be careful though, if you get into this, you may never ever get off of it. And he didn't. So he would show up to a club sometimes without a saxophone, having taken it to a pawn shop, and even though he didn't have a saxophonist, those in the crowd would say, use mine. And so this poem is written from the perspective of somebody that had loaned his horn to Charlie Parker. So it's called Bird's Horn. Nights I lent him my horns, afternoons I wrapped my hands around the horn bird blew. This was not unusual, Bird was often without a horn. He'd blow into town and everyone would offer him one. He'd play anything, played a plastic saxophone especially made, just above the level of a toy in Toronto, I'm told. They kept it, put it in a museum, piece of plastic, played once, full of only his spit. I didn't learn a thing from him. except to keep my hands on my horn, keep my hands on my horn, keep my hands on my horn, whatever horn I had. Okay, so there's one called Bass Horns. And if you go to the American Jazz Museum in Kansas City on the corner of 18th and Vine, they have that plastic saxophone. When I was volunteering there, I used to go and make my pilgrimage over my lunch hour to see it. And it was really something. This one is called At the Jam. As you may know, jam sessions are where the younger musicians or more inexperienced musicians would learn. And this is a poem about a time when I learned something at a jam session. There were lots of times, but this one's just easy to tell. This one is held at Jardines, which is a club that's now defunct, but it was on the corner of, near the corner of 47th and Main in Kansas City, which is the eastern corner of the plaza. This jam session went from 12 in the afternoon on Saturday to 12 in the morning. Actually, I got that wrong. It went from 2 p.m. on the afternoon on Saturday to 2 a.m. in the morning on Sunday. So a 12-hour jam session. And so this one is called At the Jam, Jardines 1996. The tune is Freddie Hubbard's Little Sunflower with its double-time Latin section. Quick, everything gets loud and fast. I can barely keep up, and as we lean into this blazing tempo, the bassist playing on the tips of his fingers now, I start to lose count, the quarter notes scattering like pigeons up from the sidewalk and into the violet sunset sky, clouds swirling into dabs of watercolor paint. Play out, play out, play out, I think I hear the bass man say, and I raise my stick heights, the tips of the sticks almost to my chin, my hands pumping as if there was water to be found deep within these drums. I listen again and he's repeating, his voice louder now, lay out, lay out. And I allow the rush of the rhythm section to stampede past me, leaving me silent and motionless in the darkness, seated on another drummer's crooked-legged throne. Okay, so there's another one. You may have already captured it, but in that one, what he was really asking me to do is lay out, which means stop playing, and then play out, which means play more. So I thought he was saying play more, and really he was saying stop playing, you fool. So there is one. This next one is about Art Frank, who is Chet Baker's drummer. Chet Baker was lived from 1928 to 1988. If you ever heard somebody sing My Funny Valentine, that was probably Chet Baker. If you heard somebody play it on trumpet, that could have been Chet Baker or Miles Davis, but they both kind of had that tune. And actually, even though those rivals are long dead, there's even a couple of movies that came out at the same time about those two people. So you can look them up. The movies came out about a couple of years ago. But anyway, Chet Baker was this kind of pretty boy jazz musician, and his drummer, Art Frank, had been a boxer before he became a drummer. So he would take things that he learned on the speed bag, which is a teardrop bag, the little bag up here that you go da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. He'd take those rhythms and put them on the drums. And so this is about that. Another thing it's about is it has a reference to 4s and 8s. So when you're playing in a jam session or playing with a regular group, the drummer will sometimes get a small solo. They'll get 4 bars of solo, just a few bits. And then the pianist will play 4 bars, the drummer will play 4 bars, the saxophonist will play 4 bars, the drummer will play 4 bars. It's a back and forth sort of thing. And Art Frank said, don't do that, you're wasting your energy. Just play a longer solo or don't play at all. So this is the poem about that. It's called Art Frank's Speed Bag. And play triplets. That's how I got my quick style. Boxing and drumming some days became the same thing. I
tell the younger guys when they come up to play, don't say it all in one round. Remember, you have 10, and don't solo until the end. Make a big finish. Too many guys play 4s and 8s, even in the first song. Wasted energy. Save it for the end. Make a big flourish. End big. Collaborating with Charles Mingus. Langston Hughes was the great African-American poet from Lawrence who at least came up there, lived with his aunt from about ages probably 8 to 16, don't quote me on that, it's about like that. And he loved jazz, and he followed the movements of jazz with his poetry and wrote about them. So there's jazz about swing, there's jazz about bop, there's jazz about avant-garde, and it just goes on from there. And he collaborated at one point with Charles Mingus, the great composer, band leader, and bassist. And I always said, I'd like to do something like that one day. And so that's where a lot of this came from. I'm going to read some more poems that don't have music to them, but are set in Kansas City. And this one's called Lisa's Flying Electric Piano. And you can see here is a shot of Kansas City with the Power and Light building in the background. And it's the title poem from this, and it's about when I was moving the woman I'm now married to, and something bad happened that I will never live down. So it's called Lisa's Flying Electric Piano. Her full-size electric piano flew out of my father's pickup truck. I was driving. Somehow the bass detached from the keyboard, and it all went flying into the busy intersection of 47th and Main. No one hit it, and Lisa said, let's just throw it into this dumpster when we had carried it out of the road. No, I said, let's take it to your new apartment. And we did. When I turned it on, the power eye glowed red, but it did not play. The next day I found the volume slider and turned it up, and it played perfectly. Aside from the scrapes from the road on its key cover, it was fine. I practiced tying knots, roping things down, and I dreamt at last of turning corners slow, and of a keyboard rising in flight and floating across town, and playing a well-known sonata as it flew. There's one. And if you dig the reading and want to bring a book home, I am selling books afterwards. So if you want to get one and take it home, they're $12 for one or $10 for anyone beyond one. So I have a bunch of books up here. I love making books. It's kind of one of my favorite bits about this. Speaking of books, I have a poem about books. It's called Loaning Books. And do you know that book smell? You open a book and there's some scent in it. It has a little bit about that. And if you loan books to other people, do they come back? Or do you forget to turn back a book you've loaned from someone else? It has that in it too. So it's called Loaning Books. When I offer books, she pulls the pages back from the spine until the spines crack, exposing where the pages turn from sun-heat yellow back to white. And she pokes her nose into that place where the book is stitched and takes in a long breath. And I remember my books are objects, not ideas nor words, but head stuff, lightning, energy. These books are home to my stray markings and paper scrap page holders, as well as all the scents of all the rooms I have lived in. Books with me in apartments in the city and suburbs, on trains moving from Munich to the mountains, on beaches and poolside, beside running tracks and in libraries and bookstores, on bathroom counters when the hands go through the water, on park benches and on car hoods and atop laundry washers. These books stayed when it seemed everyone and everything left off for a while. The books remained and I lend them, knowing they too may leave one day through fire or water or forgetfulness, taking all of my scent with them, scaling to the top shelf of the used bookstore, moving on into the silk and dander and perfumes and oils and varnishes of someone else's short, unrecorded, lost, lovely, obscure, solitary life. And I'll do one more, and then we can talk. So if you have questions, it's good to start thinking of them. And we'll also do the group poem. So this one's called For the Estranged. It has some drummer stuff in it, but it's essentially for those who feel left out. And so it's called For the Estranged. For the estranged, the ones the door shuts to with a wood and metal click. To the lonely, the ones who would be lovers, but their loves walked off with the pretty, the slick, the rich. To the ones with 5-string guitars who play and save for that snapped 6th string. For the drummers with beat-up drums who keep their heads tuned and play the best they can and wait and play soft and wait for that crescendo and fill it with grain, with water, with blue fire, with a crowd of new hands, hands and wheat, hands and wheat, hands and wheat. So the ones you ignore but never ignore you. This poem of love is for the ones, the estranged. This poem full of my loneliness and nights spent alone in the dark, new moon nights, coal-colored nights, nights where the owl call is for you. I hear you. I see you. I'll be with you when you open to this page. Yours will never be nights alone. My voice is here with you across time and space. And when you sing, I'm here, on rhythm guitar, on bass, on drums, on harpsichord and violin. Okay. So that is what I have prepared, besides questions. What questions do you have? And you may have favorite poets or songwriters or any number of things you want to talk about. Like, who here can think of one poet that you can remember? Any name from antiquity. You can go back to Homer, to Claude McKay, to Langston Hughes. I said some, so there's an answer there already in here. So a few of you can remember poets. That's good. I'm kind of the spokesperson for poetry in our state, so I love that people get into poetry. And actually, people that write songs or poems, it's kind of like that mathematical thing, like all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. In my opinion, most songs are also poems. There are some songs that really don't mean anything when you take the music away from them, but almost all of them do. So I think songs are also kind of poems. So you may be listening to poems all day, but just don't know it. So there is that. Yes. So let's see. Who are some of your favorite poets, or poets you can just remember their names? Anybody? Anybody remember the name of a poet? E.E. Cummings, yes. A lot of people like E.E. Cummings, and he's typographically kind of interesting on the page. Like you look at the page, and sometimes it's all over the place. Not all the time, but Grasshopper does that. He also has that beautiful line, no one's hands were so small, not even the hands of the rain. That's kind of a neat thing to have said. Yeah.
What about Maya Angelou?
Maya Angelou, yes, yeah. She was great. Yeah. Maya Angelou is a good one. And Maya Angelou is one of the only poets, like known poets, who wrote for Hallmark for a while. So the Hallmark cards during that time were really cool. Yeah. Other poets. I lived in a suburb of Kansas City and then lived in the city a little bit. And one of the Hallmark headquarters is there. I used to walk by it pretty much every day. I have drawer friends, artists, visual artists who used to work for Hallmark. I have other friends who used to write poems essentially for Hallmark and that sort of thing. So if you were to move to Kansas City, there would be an opportunity. There is something I've heard, and that's that there's like a 30-page application for Hallmark. It includes like writing a sonnet and some things like that. So it's not a piece of cake, but it's there for you if you get into it. Let's see, who else? Favorite poets? Kerouac, Jack Kerouac, yeah. And one of the more famous collections of his poetry is Mexico City Blues. I have that one on my shelf, but he wrote poems of all sizes, etc. He also wrote novels and was more famous for that, like On the Road, Darba Bums, etc. He was a beat poet. The beat poets of every color and creed kind of worship jazz. Charlie Parker was kind of like a Buddha god to them. And those beat poets, including African-American poets like Amiri Baraka, were way into jazz and its influence on our culture, living in a kind of non-materialistic way, into Eastern religion, into lots of things, but that's a little bit of that. There are some beats still living, Gary Snyder, Ann Waldman, I think Diane DePrima is still alive, Gregory Corso, Lawrence Ferlinghetti. You could find some of these people. Amiri Baraka passed away just a few months ago. He was somebody that I really loved, Amiri Baraka, great poet, and a poet of protest. If Amiri Baraka were still alive today, you would be hearing from him. Yes. Is
Has anybody heard of Murray Baraka? Earlier called Leroy Jones, wrote a play called The Dutchman, and that vaulted him into fame. He was a poet laureate of New Jersey, and he wrote a poem about 9/11, and instead of kicking him out of the post, they dissolved the post of poet laureate of New Jersey while he was in it. But dirty. Yeah, Murray Baraka was amazing. I met him once, I think it was in New York City, and I asked him to sign my book, and he said, sure thing. He said, where are you from? And I said, Kansas City. And he said, Kansas City. So there's this, there's Kansas City, the song, and that's how you would say it long ago, with a long, long I. My voice is losing it, but you know what I mean. So yeah, Murray Baraka, check him out. His son, Raz Baraka, is into politics, and you may hear from him in a few years here. Yeah, Murray Baraka. Yeah. Okay, so we got some of the beats there. Introduction to some of the beats, called beatniks, beats, etc. If you want like a quick cliff notes to the beats, there's a really cool beat book. I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's essentially a graphic novel about the beats, and it's really, really cool. I like it. Sometimes those things are just okay. It's a really good one about the beats. I actually studied with a person who was a beat, Ken Irby, who taught at KU, and he taught me a lot. Okay, what else we got here? Other questions? Yes?
It's not really poetry, but like about you, do you like reading poetry better like without music or with music?
Do I like poetry better with music or without music?
Yeah.
I like it better with music, and sometimes I come with a band. It was a little hard to get them all in my car to come here, so I accompanied myself tonight. But yeah, I love the combination of music and poetry. Like, who here has heard of Saul Williams? Nobody ever saw nobody. He combines music and poetry. He was a slam poet that then went on to become kind of a hip-hop artist, and he's lesser known, but as a slam poet, he was one of the only people to win the slam solo. Usually groups win the slam. So he's really something. Saul Williams, S-A-U-L Williams. He's really something. I think you would like him. I've seen him live once, and the place was packed. There were like 1,000 people there. And he was selling his books, and he was doing his thing. And he was an actor as one of his things, so he's very performance-based. He's really, really cool. There's a movie called Slam that stars Saul Williams, and it's loosely based on a little bit of his life. It's more loose than 8 Miles about Eminem. So, yeah. Slam's a pretty good movie, though, and it has a lot of poetry in it. Yeah. What else? Other good questions? Yes?
Somebody really intensely disliked Walt Whitman.
Yes.
What would you say to them to get them to appreciate Walt Whitman?
Is it Song of the Open Road? That's pretty good for anybody. A lot of the high modernists like Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot didn't like Walt Whitman either. They even said he's not even a poet; he's just kind of writing, just like Dorothy Parker said of Jack Kerouac. That's not writing; that's just typing. So many people don't like. He has a looser style. He was liberating us from form poems like sonnets and rhyme and meter and such. And so he had to go his own way, and some people didn't like that longer, looser style. But I like Song of the Open Road if I'm just going to show a poem by him to anybody. So people seem to like that one. Parts of Song of Myself are really kicking, especially the beginning. I Sing the Body Electric, etc. There are a bunch. Maybe find something. The Dalliance of Eagles is a little bit sexy. So maybe find the juicy ones and show them those, yeah. I have read Leaves of Grass, his collection of poetry. Walt Whitman only wrote one book, Leaves of Grass, and his first incarnation was about 40 poems long. By the time he was done with it, adding to it, it was about 300 pages of poetry. And so he just wrote and rewrote that book his whole life. And so you can see his life going on in that. At KU, the Spencer Museum has every edition of Leaves of Grass, and there's about 9 of them, depends how you count it. And you can hold them. You can go and check in, give them their driver's license as collateral, and hold those books in your hands, the ones from way on back. He was a Civil War nurse, so that was one of his kind of jobs in quotation marks. Whitman was kind of a loafer. He never really had a job for very long, and he lived frugally, and that's what he did. He thought that our own brotherhood, it was mainly men in the military then, would eventually would see our common brotherhood and we would just stop the Civil War because we saw the humanity in each other. That was his hope. He was a nurse. He helped whoever he needed to. Kind of like Hacksaw Ridge. Has anybody seen Hacksaw Ridge? They're about that doctor, soldier who goes out and helps everybody. And sometimes people from the other side or whatever. And so that was, think of Whitman's like that guy. Yeah, let's see. Good questions, good questions. Should I can do a little more drumming too if you want. I can probably even do some more drumming poems if that's more interesting. Yeah, and I can drum you on out if you want to. So, let's see. I'm feeling good about this. I mean, I haven't touched that drum in a month, so I'm glad that I can still play it. Yeah.
I guess a question I would have would be, who would be a poet that you think is, say, criminally underknown, but if you had the chance to make a movie about them, who would you feature?
Living or dead?
Up to you.
Okay. I really like Kim Adonisio. She's a kind of, we might call post-confessional poet, a poet who came in the line, but after the confessional poets. And the confessional poets you might have heard of are Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton, but there are a lot of them, like James Lowell was their, Robert Lowell, sorry, was their teacher. They were actually in a class with him. And Sexton and Plath were both in there. And they became really good friends. And when they moved away, those two women called each other on the phone and talked their poetry out. So they were way into it. Plath and Sexton were more exciting and more notable than their teacher. They pushed it forward. But Kim Adonisio is in that line along with people like Dorian Locke. At least I would like to say. We'll probably see this video and say, Kevin, we're not going to say we're in that box. But anyway, Kim Adonisio, I would love to see a movie about her. She has a new book. It's a writerly memoir called Bukowski in a Sundress. You can imagine from that title how cool it is. Bukowski was a little bit after the Beats, but was a heavy drinker and a wild man poet. And Kim Adonisio might be a little bit like that because they compared her to that. I'd love to see a movie about her. I found one of her books at City Lights Books in San Francisco and said, who is this person? This is amazing. I want to go find and meet them. And I did. She became my teacher. And so, I guess that's a little stalkerly, but I was a weirdo. I was trying to learn, you know. So I did. I actually played in a blues band with Kim Adonisio. I played drums and she played harmonica, and it was super fun and super cool. She still plays harmonica. So yeah, I would love to see a movie about Kim Adonisio. Actually, there is like a film and TV version of that, in that her daughter, Aya Cash, is an actor, and she's in a TV show called You're the Worst. So Aya Cash is Kim Adonisio's daughter. Has anybody seen You're the Worst? I don't have cable, so, but yeah. So you can see a smaller version of her. Yeah. You can Google it. It's good. It's a kicking TV show. It's kind of gritty and funny. All right. Good questions. What other? Yes.
You mentioned 8 Mile earlier. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on his recent freestyle.
The one about Trump?
Yeah.
I read it. I didn't watch it, but and as they said in the commentary on that, who better to go back and forth? So I think they're probably equally matched. See what happens. I haven't seen the tweet yet.
Equally.
Have you seen 8 Mile? He's all about the dozens.
Yeah, just equally matched in what way? It'd be interesting.
They're both about saying something quickly back and forth. So
speed. Yeah. They're equally matched in speed.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it'd be pretty cool to see a talking/rap battle between Eminem and.
I would pay. I'll drop money on that right now.
All right. We can start. Yeah, we can start our bets right away. I think it's kind of interesting. So we'll see. Has anybody seen the Eminem thing? I haven't seen it yet, but I read the thing. All right, 1/3 of the audience has seen the Eminem thing. I'll have to go watch the video, but I read the thing about it, and
you should watch the video.
All right.
Kind of hard to. No, I believe that earlier when I saw, but I don't know what it's.
Yeah. Eminem's kind of a local. I mean, he's a Midwesterner, isn't he? Isn't he from Missouri?
originally? I think he lives in Detroit.
He lives somewhere around here.
I think he was in our area as a young person. Yeah. I know he's all about Detroit now. Yeah. See, I actually didn't know anything about Eminem until one of my German friends, a German rapper, said, "You got to listen to this guy. It's like your next door neighbor." And I was like, "Okay."
I resisted getting into them for a really long time.
Yeah. Okay, we've gone from Walt Whitman to Eminem. We'll move forward in time.
I have a broad range of interests.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was going to mention Bukowski, but you beat me to it.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. Yeah, Bukowski's really interesting. I mean, you'll never be bored with a Bukowski poem. Yeah. Okay, other questions? I didn't think we would get into the dozen of battles later. Yes. Oh, just moving. Okay. It's like a silent auction. You move a little bit, and they say, "Here's the tea set you get to take home for $100." Have you been to a silent auction before? You like move, and they say you got something, and you have to pick it up on your way out. Yeah. All right. Other questions? How are we doing? Got a little time. Yes.
Well, I guess just going back a moment or two, but I think you buried the lead on us when you were talking about your German rapper friend.
Okay. Yes, I do have a friend who's a German rapper. His name is Sebastian Barth, or Seb, and he has actually used some of my drum stuff. I'll play it, and I'll record it and take it back and forth. We were at Sarah Lawrence College because a poet had brought us a bunch of people together, and Sebastian and I started Skyping and talking after that. Actually, it's kind of an interesting story in that I was hosting a poet to Kansas City along with the Writer's Place named Thomas Lux. And Thomas Lux, I took him out to hear some jazz and things like that, and at one point he said, "Why don't you come and visit us this summer to a writing conference?" And I said, "I don't have the money to do that, and I applied to your school and I can't afford that either." And he said, "Can you catch?" And I said, like baseball or softball? I said, "Yes." "Can you catch?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "Come play on my softball team this summer, and I'll waive the tuition for the summer program, but you've got to catch on my softball team while you're there." So that's what I did. I caught on Thomas Lux's softball team, and I learned from him, and I met the German rapper Sebastian while I was there. Sebastian had been brought in from Germany to translate Lux's poems into German, and so there it was.
So you got a scholarship to that.
I did, a softball scholarship.
Cool.
Yeah, so, yeah, it was something. I don't know if I was a great catcher, but it's just a bunch of people playing, yeah. I think I even pitched a little bit. So, yeah. Thomas Lux actually died about 4 months ago. He was one of my great influences. If I had to name my influences, the big three are Kim Anastasio, Thomas Lux, and Tim Seibles. Tim Seibles is from Philadelphia. He's an African-American poet who writes about pop culture as one of his things, including, he has a bunch of cool poems about Blade. Has anybody seen any of the Blade movies? Blade? Yes, Wesley Snipes as the vampire, half human vampire killer. It's really cool stuff. The Blade poems are in a collection called Fast Animal, and it's really, really cool. So, Tim Seibles. If I had the Blade poem, I would read it. There's a bunch of them. One is my favorite. Yes? You want me to play on the drums? Okay. Let's see here. I wonder if I have any more poems that go to drums. I do have one here. Haven't done it in a while, but... Okay. These things are called brushes, and they used to be wire whisks or fly swatters, and they eventually evolved into this thing, this instrument, or tool for instruments. In Calvin Rosie's store, he loved the sound of brushes. He kept cardboard near the drum section and stools low to the floor. He made circles on the cardboard, left and right hands spinning. We played in opposite directions. Stir that soup, he would say. stir that soup, and we would tap out time, the brush lifting from the cardboard and returning with a whip sound. Others would practice the press, the flam, and the Worcester rough. All we needed was some cardboard, which he supplied, and our brushes, their wires trimmed so that nothing caught at the edges of the cardboard, wires slim and gray and uniform, creating a fan shape, a whisk to stir and slap against cardboard and Calvin Rosie's stole. There's enough. So, yeah, these things are brushes, and they're kind of underused. Rock musicians stopped kind of using them because they're not very loud, but you'll still hear them once in a while. You especially hear them in jazz, a little bit in blues. In jazz, you might hear that thing I was just playing quite often in many speeds, like. In blues, you might hear something like. You'd hear it in country like, so that sort of thing. Yeah, there's lots of ways you can use them. And I'll move some of the I'll move them over here. There's also sort of some trick stuff you can do with them because they're kind of weird looking. You can even go. You can go. You can go with folk people. Take up drums and percussion, consider the brush because it has lots of uses. And the stir the soup thing. You can hold a conversation while you're doing that. So yeah, they're really something. And you think they look like little kind of delicate pliable things or not. Some of the strongest drummers of the time, like bodybuilder-like drummers like Philly Joe Jones, would play brushes because they actually take some strength to play well. You have to kind of manhandle them to get good sounds. So I mean, you don't have to, but if you want to go, brushes, one of my favorite things. So yeah. Has anybody ever seen somebody live playing with brushes before? They are a dying art. A few people. So yeah, I didn't do everything I can do with them, but there they are. I really like them. Let me think. What else? Brushes. It's probably enough for the brushes. So let's see here. Do we have other questions? It can be poetry or jazz influence. Poetry and jazz both share the same month. The National Jazz Month is also the National Poetry Month, which is April, and so that's a good time to hear either of those things. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier, you said that many songs are poems, and I just wondered if you had a particular example in mind that you've thought, that's a beautiful poem. Right.
Since Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize for Literature a little while ago, Tangled Up in Blue is a pretty kickin' song. A lot of Paul Simon's Graceland songs are pretty good too. Emmylou Harris's songs are mostly poetic. Dar Williams' songs are poetic. Some of Amy Winehouse's songs are pretty poetic. All of Tori Amos' songs are poetic. It's just kind of, just search around. And people have different tastes in poetry. Like, somebody might like a John Cougar Mellencamp song better than a Townes Van Zandt or a Bob Dylan song. And, they all have poetic elements. Putting words together in unique ways, using imagery, using the five senses to describe something, telling a story in a song, using a level of detail and compression that we don't use in ordinary speech. these are all elements of poetry that songs also share. Now there are some songs that it's like, what are you talking about? And so I might not say they're not maybe as poetic. Wrapped up like a noose, another runner in the night. That's kind of interesting, but very misleading. So there's that one, that line.
I never could understand what you're saying.
Yes, that. I would have to say that line doesn't work very well. But so.
Steve Allen recited at the Grammys one time, "I'm going to get me some of that hot stuff, baby, tonight," as if it was a poem. He just read it.
Yes.
Or not all that. Yes. Variety there.
Yes, and you've probably seen the Captain Kirk recitation of poetry. You know, so there's that too. We can ruin things very easily if we look at it. That's what I'm saying.
A good actor might not be able to do that.
Yes. Okay. Good questions. Good thoughts. We have others. Other things we want to know about. Poets you want to try out? Who has like a poet that you like, and I can maybe guess at some other poets like that person you might like? Anybody have a poet that they like and you want to hear some more like that? Like the other day somebody was saying they like Elizabeth Bishop, and if you like Elizabeth Bishop, you might like Mary Oliver. You know, there's like people that are the literary children of those people. Walt Whitman to Allen Ginsberg to Frank O'Hara to any number of people. Yeah.
What about Shel Silverstein?
Yeah, that's a good one. I'm trying to think. Well, she's quite different, but is popular. Rupi Kaur. Has anybody heard of the Insta poet Rupi Kaur who wrote Milk and Honey? She's just as accessible, darker subjects, but she also draws and has poems on the same page, like Shel Silverstein. She's just as popular. Yeah. It's Kaur is her last name, and it's Rupi, R-U-P-I, Rupi Kaur, Milk and Honey. She's super, super famous. Probably the most famous living American poet right now when it comes to books sold. She's an Insta poet, so she got famous in this new way where you write your poem out or draw it out, shoot it on Instagram, and then broadcast it to the world. Yeah, and she has a couple of books now, maybe 3, I don't know, more than one is what I'm saying. And she draws and does the poems, and they're very accessible. So kind of like Shel Silverstein, they don't rhyme like his, but and they're line drawings just like Shel Silverstein. And she even deals with sorts of abuse in her poem too, in her poems, and so she's a survivor of some difficult things, poet of witness, poet of testimony, etc. So some of them are like that. Yeah. Okay, we got that one. Other questions? Yes.
If you had someone say, "Oh, poetry is boring," who would you introduce them to first? What poet? How would you entice them?
I would say Saul Williams is not a bad bet. We were talking about him a little earlier. You can't be bored during a Saul Williams reading/performance. Do they have to be living? Okay. Well, Bukowski's pretty exciting too. You listen to a recording of Bukowski or look at the poem on the page, but certainly a recording. That's nothing boring there. I'm trying to think of like exciting without being just exciting for excitement's sake. Yeah, there are lots. Just who to go to first. Well, I like Amir Baraka too. He's never boring either. He's passed away, but he was a really exciting poet. Like there's one called, I think it's called Wail, We Wail, something like that is one of the lines in it. Wailers, that's the name of the song, of the poem/song. There's one where he's saying that with a funk band. There's no way you can be bored by that. Wailers, like it plays off of Moby Dick, but yeah. And find the one with the funk drummer behind him and the saxophonist. I think that one's also on a recording. It is on a recording.
We all like different things, though. I'm trying to think of something that would be a little more contemporary. The REM guy, Michael Stipe, did some stuff with Burroughs that's pretty cool. Yeah. And I'm walking around. What was the name of the performance artist who had her ice skates on, and she had her ice skates frozen in a block of ice and was on the sidewalk in New York City? And she's never boring either. She's also a performance poet. I wish I could remember her name. It's not in my mind. It's walking around Tori Amos, but she's older than Tori Amos. Yeah, I can't remember, but you could Google that and probably find her name. I saw her once in concert, and she had like a little voice recorder. Now they're smaller than they used to be, but she took this voice recorder and said something into it and put it in her mouth and had it playing, and also talked at the same time and played piano. It was really weird. And the poem was about aliens, so nothing boring about that. There's no looking at that. Yeah, I wish I could remember. Anyway. It'll come to me later. Other questions? You want me to do some more poetry? I can say some more poetry? Yes, you want to do that? Okay, I'll do a few more. There's a little town near Emporia. Emporia's not very big either. It's about 25,000, and there's a place near us 10 minutes away called Opie, and they're famous for a chicken house. And so you can go there and get some chicken. And this is a poem about going there and seeing a book behind the counter. At the Opie Chicken House, they have like at the cash register some books that you can buy if you want. So we read. At the Opie Chicken House, behind a glass, there's a copy of Ken Ohm's new book, Ducks Across the Moon. And an old woman and her husband cane their way to the corner, pay with cash the bills old and crumpled and green, and ask about the book. The kid behind the counter, who looks like the town quarterback, says, "I didn't write it. Heck, I don't know." And the old couple walks on and go home, and along the way mention books they do know and love and read, and then slump in peace and sleep on their lazy boys, the TV, snow, the books held in their laps, the reading lamps still on. There's one about the visiting a chicken house and literacy. Their books. Hopefully you guys like books. Like who reads books regularly? If you're in school, you're kind of encouraged to do this, right? So there's required reading and non-required reading for this stage in your life. So I love books. I mean, I've got books all over the place. I have a little kind of hovel at home, my wife calls it, where I have books and boxes, and that's all it is, pretty much. Books, boxes, and that drum gets to live in there too. And so there's just books all over the place. There's shelves, and there's books stacked on tables and stacked from the floor. They're all over. It's a horrible fire hazard. But I'm a serial browser, so I'll go in and read a little bit of something. If I'm not interested, I'll go on to something else. And I do that all the time. Sometimes I'll read something all the way to the end, but it has to grab me. So if you're thinking I'm bored with something, or you're thinking you're bored with something, that is natural. It is okay. You may have to read something and get done with class, but when you're done having to read things, and quotation having, you can read whatever you want, however much of it you want. And then if it grabs you, keep reading. If it not, take it back to the library or give it to a friend or whatever. But don't feel like you got to read something to the end unless it's required, and then it is. But I love to browse. I'll be working on 30 books at once, reading a little bit from each. And if they start to lose my interest, I just move on and read something else. So there's my little soapbox about serial browsing. Yeah. Well, I can read you something else if you'd like. Let me drag out a list here. You mentioned Shel Silverstein. He has a book called Falling Up or something like that. And I have a poem that's a riff off of that. We hired this guy to help us move some of the junk out of our basement when it got flooded. And we didn't pay him very much.
because we could not afford very much. We needed some help because there was a whole lot of junk. And it was just getting moldy and it was wet down there. At one point, there was a foot of water in our basement, which is about from here to there. And we had a dehumidifier that was sitting in the water, running, trying to get rid of the water. It was still plugged in. And I was like, I'm not going to unplug that. Somebody with some rubber boots, please come and help us, because it was running in the water, trying to suck the water up. So anyway, here I'll read Fall Up. Gunkel and I had this big mirror between us, hefting it into the back of his blue pickup truck. Gunkel's real slow, a giant in blue jeans and green Crocs, wearing a white t-shirt with battery acid on it. His glasses are thicker than my thumb. So we grab hold of this monster mirror, and it glints, and we both look into that mirror, noticing the clarity of that blue sky, and those green sycamore leaves reflected so perfectly, it appears you could just dive on into that mirror and sink into the sky. And we think the same thing. You could fall up, Gunkel says, and just keep on falling. Nothing would stop you. And that was the way of it. Gunkel's mind was now my mind, and I was in that mirror falling on up through those white smoke clouds headed towards an orange sun. Gunkel and I stacked box bed springs on top of that mirror and some branches from out front, and I could hear that large mirror crack, but I think Gunkel and I could still see it, that vision of sinking into sky, drowning with only the sun to hold us up. So I had this moment with this guy that thought that we could fall into the mirror, and it was kind of beautiful. I mean, people think different ways, and there's nothing wrong with that. In this case, it was kind of a transcendent moment where I was thinking, I'm back like being a kid. I can fall into the sky and just keep falling. Okay, I think we may be close to our time here. I don't want to overstay my welcome. Yes?
Could you read our
Yes, we need to do that. Thank you for reminding me. Okay, so as a group, we wrote this poem. So, at least for this hour, you all are poets. I hope some of you will keep at it, inspired by this experience or something. So here it goes. Your hand in my hand, like the warmth of an autumn sun, orange and mild, hot like a hot wing, like silent writings in the sand, stands stirred by fingers like grabbing a star from the sky, or putting cheese on a hamburger, like fine wine, like life gets better with time passing by, wondering why, or when you see a hot guy making awkward contact in the eye, or like wanting to kiss a girl, making it hard to say goodbye. All right. We went all through life in that way. Yeah. Wow. It was a joy spending some time with y'all. Thanks for bringing me here. If you have questions, come up and talk. If you want to buy a book, you can do that too. Just come by either way, and we'll stay in touch. You can Google me on Facebook, Kevin Rabus, or Poet Laureate of Kansas, and keep the poetry in your life. Thank you.
Would everybody make sure you signed that? Because it helps the art lives. They know